Emmanuel Costa, who I don't know who everyone sees in the corners, but I see him on the corner here, and my colleague Edith Dobbs-Weinstein, who's on the other corner there. Just before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to mention our next talk, which is coming up on January 27th. We'll have Enrico Galvani from the University of St. Andrews, and he's going to be talking on the School of Pain, Sophie de Grouchy on positive suffering. But today, we're very excited to have Eliza Starbuck-Little with us to give a talk. She is a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the University of Chicago, Division of Social Sciences. She received her PhD also at the University of Chicago from the Committee of Social Thought, where she wrote a dissertation on the self-exhibition of reason, Hegel on intuition and logical content. Sounds like some of what she's going to talk about today will draw from that dissertation. Her research interests include Hegel's theoretical philosophy, the epistemology of literature, and the role of dogmatic physicalism in 20th century analytic philosophy. And today, the title of her talk is Hegel and Schelling on Intuition. Please join me in welcoming Eliza Little.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks so much to all of the organizers. I'm really delighted to be here speaking to you. I have a handout that I have a link for, and I will stick it in the chat for everybody. Here it is. Hopefully that works. All right, so with that, I'll just jump right in. I'm going to read the talk off the paper. Sorry, Zoom. Okay, so Hegel and Schelling on intuition. In recent years, mainstream Hegel scholarship has come at first begrudgingly and now with somewhat more enthusiasm to accept that Schelling exerted an important philosophical influence on Hegel. Due to years of neglect and the exceptionally challenging character of both thinkers' work, this influence is only just beginning to be properly understood. So my immediate goal in the paper that follows is to contribute to this emerging conversation in the literature by demonstrating one of the ways and looking at one of the ways in which Schelling's influence can be seen in Hegel's thought. Specifically, I'll argue that one of Hegel's key inheritances from Schelling can be found in his theory of intuition. My interest is not, however, in the influence of Schelling's somewhat infamous, maybe wrongly so, theory of intellectual intuition on Hegel's theory, on Hegel's thought. Rather, I propose to show that Hegel takes on a different sort of intuition endorsed by Schelling, namely a variety of symbolic intuition that is derived from Kant's account of aesthetic judgment in his third critique. Schelling's theory of symbolic intuition, I want ultimately to claim, serves as a formal foundation for Hegel's mature understanding of the way in which apperceptive synthesis functions, that is, the way in which logical forms like judgments and inferences come to have an a priori content. And just in case you're not a post-Kantian, and a priori content doesn't do anything for you, I'll also suggest, by means of the discussion of Schelling, that this form of intuition sheds some light on the mechanics of the post-Kantian project of describing a form of rationalism where the paradigm case of reason is not divine reason, but rather historically situated human-mindedness. The paper has 3 sections. So first that's actually a lie. It has 4 sections. First, in sections 1 and 2, or in 2 and 3, I give a formal definition of symbolic intuition in the post-Kantian context. Next, in 4, I look at some concrete examples of Schelling's use of symbolic intuition. And then finally, in 5, I discuss Hegel's inheritance and offer a suggestion about the role this logical form plays for Hegel in his science of logic. So it's a bit wild, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, so to start, what is symbolic intuition? There's a technical answer to this question that I'll get to in a moment, but in order to motivate it, I want to begin in a slightly roundabout way by considering a different question, namely, what is the philosophical problem to which symbolic intuition is a solution? On my reading, Hegel and especially Schelling become interested in symbolic cognition very early on, symbolic intuition very early on in their philosophical careers, because they believe this kind of intuition will help them to accomplish one of their shared programmatic goals for post-Kantian philosophy. And I want to claim that this goal is laid out in a very early fragmentary text known as the Oldest System Program of German Idealism, or the OSP. The OSP is a fragmentary text that has been dated to 1796, the time when Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling were living and working together in the Tübinger Stift. The text was not discovered until 1917 when Franz Rosenzweig accidentally stumbled across it in the archives of the Prussian State Library while he was in the process of doing research for a book on Hegel. The authorship of the manuscript has been disputed since the moment of its discovery. Although the text is copied out in Hegel's handwriting, the grandiose tone seemed to Rosenzweig to belong distinctly to Schelling, and we'll see why when we get to the Schelling part of this talk. And the definitive contemporary account given by Eckhart Forster persuasively attributes the text to Hölderlin. Most likely, and the way I understand the text, is that the three friends, they were working together on the ideas that they present in this text. Maybe Hölderlin was the person who really formulated them, but I think we are entitled to attribute them to all three of these thinkers, at least at some point in their careers. So for our purposes, it's not the facts of the fragment's authorship, but rather the shared ideas contained within that are of particular interest. So the extant portion of the OSP articulates a desideratum that I take to be essential for understanding Hegel and Schelling's early writings, regardless of who penned the text. Specifically, the author or authors argue that the coming philosophy, i.e. the post-Kantianism of which Hegel and Schelling will themselves form the vanguard, must recognize the paramount importance of aesthetic concerns for philosophical thinking. The OSP author states, quote, and this is on your handout, "The philosopher must possess as much aesthetic power as the poet. Those people without an aesthetic sense are philosophers of literalness, are Buchstabenphilosophen. The philosophy of spirit is an aesthetic philosophy. One can be spiritually brilliant in nothing. One cannot even think about history without an aesthetic sense, aesthetischer Sinn." Now, at first blush, this demand for the cultivation of aesthetic sense amongst philosophers reads like a piece of rhetorical enthusiasm on the part of some young philosophy students who find their discipline lacking in stylistic flair. I think we've all been there. But a closer analysis reveals that the exhortation is to be understood in a more rigorous way. This becomes apparent when the author goes on to describe in further detail precisely what the exercise of the aesthetic sense in question will entail. He writes, quote, "I will speak here of an idea which, as far as I know, has not crossed anyone's mind. We must have a new mythology, but this mythology must be in the service of ideas. It must become a mythology of reason. Until we make ideas aesthetic, that is mythological, they are of no interest to the people. Mythology must become philosophical to make the people rational, and philosophy must become mythological to make philosophers sensuous." So this passage invokes the apparatus of Kant's critical philosophy in order to make a directly anti-Kantian point about the aims of philosophy. The proposal that ideas need to be made aesthetic is an unmistakable reference to Kant's first and third critiques, where he argues at length that rational ideas, that is, ideas like God, the soul, and the unity of nature, are unknowable because they can never be made sensible. The OSP then describes a desideratum for philosophical work that is specifically targeted against this premise of Kant's critical philosophy. And I call this, I've laid it out on the handout, the post-Kantian aesthetic demand. So the demand can be formulated as follows. Reason must be made sensible. Now, although the demand itself is anti-Kantian, the terms in which the author of the OSP proposes that it be satisfied are, interestingly, appropriated from remarks that Kant makes in the Critique of Judgment. The OSP author proposes that the specific way in which reason is to be made sensible is by means of a creative contribution from the thinking subject, that is, from the aesthetic sense or power of philosophers. He describes this creative contribution as being mythological in character. Now, this language may seem to just be fanciful or metaphorical, but in fact, it actually hews quite closely to an aspect of the formal apparatus of the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, the first part of the third critique. What the OSP author terms mythology is, I think, nothing other than a synonym for the formal device that Kant terms symbolic intuition. So now we arrive at symbolic intuition in the third critique. Thus, symbolic intuition comes on the scene as a device by means of which the the post-Kantian aesthetic demand that reason be made sensible can be satisfied. So this is the project. We're going to satisfy this demand by means of symbolic intuition. So with this functional sketch of symbolic intuition in view, we are now in a position to tackle the actual technical definition. Kant describes symbolic intuition in the context of his larger theory of conceptual exhibition or Darstellung, a topic which is infrequently discussed and poorly understood, as far as I'm aware, in the literature. In the post-Kantian German tradition, conceptual exhibition describes the process by means of which concepts are linked up with specific objects in the world. It is the post-Kantian successor, if anyone works on early modern, to the style of proof known as the geometrical method. And from a contemporary point of view, maybe if this is helpful, I think the best way of understanding the theory of conceptual exhibition is as a German idealist analog to theory of reference. The theory of conceptual exhibition that Hegel and Schelling are working with originates in Kant's first and third critiques, as I've mentioned. So in the Kantian picture, the need for conceptual exhibition arises out of the cognitive situation of finite thinkers like human beings who have the capacity for conceptual thought, but who do not create the objects of their thought simply in virtue of thinking about them. This is very well trodden ground, but quickly, in Kant's view, finite rational thinkers have two distinct faculties of cognition. Kant writes famously that there are two stems of human cognition, namely sensibility and understanding. These two stems each furnish the mind with a different kind of cognitive representation. So sensibility provides intuitions, while the understanding provides concepts. And although the two stems are formally distinguishable, they are operationally independent. And so Kant tells us in another very well-known passage that we're actually legally obligated to include if we went to Chicago in every paper that we give, quote, "Thoughts without content are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind," close quote. So in successful cases of cognition, these two kinds of representations are combined. And this is where this topic of conceptual exhibition comes on the scene. Conceptual exhibition is one aspect of the synthetic activity of a successful cognitive act. In order to bring the combination of intuitions and concepts about, Kant writes, two things are needed. There's two acts that must happen. First, it's necessary to make the mind's concepts sensible, i.e. to add an object to them in intuition. And second, to make the mind's intuitions understandable, that is to bring them under concepts. So conceptual exhibition is the name for the first of these procedures. It's the way a concept is made sensible by means of the addition of an intuited object. Now, different kinds of concepts require different kinds of exhibitions. And to preview, I've laid some of them out, or hopefully, or at least 4 kinds out on the handout. So to start, here's an empirical example that Kant gives in the third critique. In that text, Kant states that the empirical concept, the human eye, is exhibited by means of a dissection. He writes, quote, "If an anatomist has set forth the concept of the human eye discursively and goes on to dissect the eye to make the concept intuitable, we say that he demonstrates or exhibits this organ." But it is not only empirical concepts that require demonstration. Pure concepts, such as the pure concepts of the understanding, the categories, require demonstration as well. These a priori logical concepts are supposed to condition the possibility of knowing objects in general, and so they must be shown to be applied to sensible objects in general. So in the first critique, Kant argues that the a priori forms of intuition, space and time, provide an a priori exhibition of the pure concepts of the understanding. And he devotes the obscure part of his text called the schematism to discussing these exhibitions and how they work. This, at any rate, is what the schematism is supposed to do. The success of the section is luckily not our problem here. But now, okay, so our interest here, per the OSP, is ideas of reason. And unlike pure concepts of the understanding, in the Kantian picture, Kant's thought is that ideas of reason cannot be demonstrated. You cannot give a sensible complement because there is no spatiotemporal intuition that can be logically adequate to these ideas. So taking, for example, an idea of reason like God, we cannot pick out any corresponding spatiotemporal object to which this idea refers. While, therefore, these concepts or ideas, the reason I use both is because Hegel calls it a concept, Schelling will call it a concept, but Kant calls it an idea, but it's the same thing. It's so always, whenever you hear concept of reason, idea of reason, it's this God, the soul, and the unity of nature kind of thing. Okay, so while therefore these concepts are thinkable, they are not, properly speaking, knowable in the Kantian picture. Kant writes, quote, "If anyone goes so far as to demand that we establish the objective reality of concepts, the ideas, for the sake of their theoretical cognition, then he asks for something impossible, because absolutely no intuition can be given that would be adequate to them. And this sounds very final. But it turns out that this is not actually Kant's last word on the conceptual exhibition of rational ideas. In the Critique of Judgment, the third critique, Kant proposes that there is in fact a way of exhibiting rational ideas in intuition, albeit an indirect and inferior way. In that text, Kant offers a taxonomy of the kinds of intuitions that can provide content for a priori concepts. And there he proposes that there are in fact two distinct species of such intuitions, the schematic and the symbolic. He writes, quote, "All exhibition as making a concept sensible is of one of two kinds, either schematic or symbolic, where to a concept which only reason can think and to which no sensible intuition can be adequate, an intuition is attributed with which the power of judgment proceeds in a way merely analogous to that which it observes in schematization." So here we learn that although there are no intuitions that are adequate to the pure concepts of reason, these concepts can still be exhibited in a privative way by means of inadequate sensible intuitions. And intuitions that serve this purpose are described as symbolic. So sticking with the rational idea of God, here's an example of one such intuition, symbolic intuition, from the Prolegomena. This is, sorry, I have so many tabs. This is on the handout. If I say that we are compelled, this is Kant from the Prolegomena, if I say that we are compelled to look upon the world as if it were the work of a supreme understanding and will, I say nothing more than, in the way that a watch, a ship, and a regiment are related to an artisan, a builder, and a commander, the sensible world, or everything that makes up the basis of the sum total of appearances, is related to the unknown, God, which I do not thereby cognize according to what it is in itself, but only according to what it is for me, that is, with respect to the world of which I am a part. I am a part. End quote. Now, there's an extensive formal story to be told about how exactly Kant thinks symbolic intuitive exhibitions work. It has to do with Kant's logical account of analogy. So it has a different synthetic structure than schematic exhibition. And I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested in those technical details. But here I'll just flag one feature and spare you most of the technical details, specifically the fact that the thing being symbolized in this example is not God itself, but rather the relationship of God to the world. The relationship is an activity, right? It's an active relationship, and it's here being likened to the relationship between an artisan and a watch, a builder and a ship, and between a commander and a regiment. So in this case, a symbolic intuition can display that characterizes the relationship between two things and use that as a symbol to pick out the relationship between God and the world. So you have to have one term available, but yeah, for here, the most important thing is just that it's an activity that's being symbolized. So on the Kantian view, the project facing someone interested in giving an a priori demonstration of the actuality of the ideas of reason rather than the concepts of the understanding would be to describe a symbolism of pure reason. And the description of such a symbolism of pure reason is, I believe, exactly the project that is proposed in the OSP and then taken on first by Schelling and subsequently by Hegel. All right, good. And so now we're done with Kant. We don't have to talk about him anymore. We can get to the good part. We can talk about Schelling and Hegel. So thus far, this is section 4. Thus far, I've argued that from a formal perspective, describing a symbolism of pure reason is a coherent post-Kantian goal. But it's obviously another thing altogether to envision what this philosophically novel project actually, in fact, entails. What the hell does this mean? Good question. So in the remainder of the paper, I'm going to look at some examples of symbolic intuition in various texts from Schelling and Hegel in order to begin to get the details of this project into view, just to give an idea of what it would mean to give a symbolism of pure reason and to describe a philosophical picture that centers around this project. So as we will see, these textual examples are superficially quite disparate. We'll look at things like art, logic, and then also some other things from Schelling, mythology. And we'll see that in light of this, it will be just a quick prefacing remark about what it is they're meant to share in common. That is, what is the distinguishing feature of symbolic conceptual exhibition as Schelling and Hegel understand it, what unites all these accounts. I lied, one last mention of Kant. From a Kantian point of view, the fundamental problem surrounding symbolic conceptual exhibition is that these sorts of exhibitions are always privative, right? For Kant, schematism good, symbol bad. Symbolic intuitions cannot be logically adequate complements to concepts, and thus symbolic intuitions never yield knowledge. For Kant, the fact that ideas of reason can only be demonstrated symbolically and not schematically is evidence of the unknowability of these ideas, that is, their lack of standing as proper concepts. But obviously, the project of the OSP is precisely this anti-Kantian project of giving a sensible account of the ideas of reason as proper concepts. So on my reading, Schelling and Hegel's use of symbolic intuition flips this claim directly on its head. In their works, acts of synthesis involving symbolic intuitions, I want to argue, become the paradigm case of conceptual exhibition. And in order to take this view on, however, they must demote acts of schematic synthesis to second place, right? You can only have one or the other, you can't have both. Thus, for both Schelling and Hegel, concepts that are demonstrated by means of spatiotemporal intuition are cognitively inferior to those that are demonstrated symbolically. What does that mean? This presents, I want to claim, in both cases as a rejection of Kant's empirical realism. So on the reading that I will advance here, both Hegel and Schelling think that spatiotemporally available objects, so mid-sized objects like cups, tables, couches, etc., are ontologically inferior to, not as real as, objects that are symbolically available. Okay, that's just programmatic here, right? Obviously, we need to know what are these symbolically available objects in order to assess whether or not this is a very good claim. Okay, so with that in mind, let's turn to the actual text in order to see exactly what this class of symbolically available objects might be. And there's some different thoughts. Hegel and Schelling disagree about it, and Schelling disagrees with himself, as usual, about it at different points in his career, I think. So I'm going to look at three, kind of more 2.5, because one look will be very quickly, but three texts by Schelling. So any of you who are familiar with Schelling at all know that periodization is a really big deal in Schelling scholarship, because on the, at least the largely held view, his views seem to change over time. Hegel famously said of Schelling that he conducted his philosophical education in public because he changes his mind all the time, perhaps. But Schelling's interest in symbolic intuition actually remains remarkably constant throughout his career from beginning to end. And the intuitions that, or the texts that I have selected bear this out insofar as they range from his very early to his very late writings. So I'm going to look first at a collection of very early notes on Plato's Timaeus, the Timaeus Essay that are from 1794. So these predate the OSP by 2 years and are written when Schelling was only 19, jerk. Next, I'll look at his 1804 Philosophy of Art, and I'll conclude by mentioning the 1842 Introduction to the Philosophy of Mythology, which actually is largely very congruent with the view in the Philosophy of Art. So first, the Timaeus Essay. This is really more of a collection of notes. It gets called the Timaeus Essay, but it's really a bunch of collected notes on the Timaeus and Philebus that Schelling, they were never formally published. They're kind of collected from Schelling's journals. And the project in this text is to read, or Schelling's project in this text is to read Plato's metaphysical work through a loosely Kantian lens. The essay offers a preliminary example of how it is possible to experiment with the structures provided by Kant's critical philosophy in a way that modifies them along the symbolic lines that I've been discussing. So the essay has two features of particular interest for the discussion at hand, I think. So first, Schelling's application of a modified version of Kant's table of categories to Plato's text. And second, his proposal that the elements, yes, those elements, fire, water, earth, and air, replace the Kantian schemata in the Platonic picture. I really love Schelling. Really, I find this very exciting. So Schelling draws a parallel. I'm going to look at both of these things, first at the categories and then at the schemata. So Schelling draws a parallel between Plato's late ontology and Kant's theory of mind by mapping the four kinds of being or existence that Plato describes in the Philebus onto the four function headings that structure Kant's table of categories. And I've given you a table showing this on the handout. He does this in the following way. So Plato has four existence. It isn't important for our purposes here to know what these actually mean. And I think you'd need to do a lot of philosophical work in order to assess whether this is a good idea. But this is what he's up to. So the four existents are the unlimited, the limited, causality, and the common. And then we have Kant's functions correspondingly, quality, quantity, relation. And then there isn't a correspondence between modality is like notably left out. So the correspondence obviously is not one-to-one. Most obviously, there's a marked disconnect between the existent that Plato calls commonality, to koinon, and Kant's function of modality. The nature of this disconnect is philosophically significant. It's not simply a place where the parallel Schelling's drawing breaks down, but rather the specific way in which Platonic commonality and Kantian modality differ is, I think, indicative of what Schelling's trying to achieve by means of his reading of Plato. So the disconnect between commonality and modality has to do with the different ways that Plato and Kant understand the involvement of subjective perception in determining an object's existence. Kant's modal categories index subjective intentional states. They have to do with the relationship between an object she's judging. So in the Kantian picture, the modal status of an object describes something about its availability as an object of perception and thus as an object given in spatio-temporal intuition, which, as we know, is the enemy of the symbolic project in some ways. So on Schelling's reading, Platonic commonality is also bound up with the modal status of objects. But as we should expect from a philosophical pictures, the picture of Plato actually, and also Schelling's Plato, which centers on divine-mindedness rather than human-mindedness, the modal status of objects has nothing to do with their relationship to finite rational perceivers, right? As for most people. Instead, commonality describes the way in which the other existents are combined with one another in order to come into physical being. Schelling writes that, quote, both the limited and the unlimited are bound together in the common. And he describes commonality as being, among other things, quote, the world in its presence, right? So the existence of the world. I understand Schelling here as using Plato's text to try to make a proposal about how the Kantian categories of the understanding might be cut apart from spatio-temporal intuition. We can conceive of Schelling as trying to transform the pure categories of the understanding into ideas of reason. Now, while such an effort would border on perversity from a Kantian point of view, why would you ever want to do this? In the Schellingian picture, is the way for the proposal of an alternative symbolic account of the exhibition of the categories. So in the Timaeus Essay, Schelling tries to give such a symbolic account by means of an intervention into the schematism. After aligning Plato's existence and Kant's categories in the way described above, Schelling makes the following suggestion. He argues that the four elements, again, yes, those elements, fire, water, earth, and air, discussed in the Timaeus, serve as intermediary formal concepts by means of which the four existents are applied to the visible world. And although Schelling does not explicitly name the portion of the first critique that this invokes, his text makes clear and constant reference to the first critique schematism chapter. So the parallels are striking once you begin to look for them, even more striking because I've put them in columns on the handout. So for example, Schelling writes, I think this is T9, the elements insofar as they appear are nothing less than forms applied to matter. This echoes the functionality Kant assigns to the schemata. Kant writes, quote, clearly there must be something that is third, something that must be homogeneous with the category on the one hand and with the appearance on the other, and that thus makes possible the application of the category to the appearance. So the elements, like the schemata, are going to be the crucial aspect of this application of categories to appearances. Further, Schelling's elements, like Kant's schemata, are pure forms that do not themselves appear empirically. They are, in Kantian terms, rules for synthesis that condition empirical appearances. So here's Kant, quote, a schema of a pure concept of the understanding is something one cannot bring to any image whatsoever. Such a schema is rather only the pure synthesis conforming to a rule expressed by the category of unity according to concepts as such. And here's Schelling, quote, by the intelligible elements, Plato understands not the particular physical existing intelligible substances of fire, water, so on, but rather the ideas as such, the pure form of the understanding through which the world is ordered. And maybe you might quibble there, like obviously he's playing a bit fast and loose with the notion of transcendental imagination, but I think that he thinks he's entitled to do that because of his own notion of mindedness in contrast to Kant's. If anyone has questions, we can also discuss that. Then finally, in the last set of quotes, both thinkers contrast their response against the idea of merely empirical universals formed by inductive reasoning from empirical sense data. Kant emphasizes the distinction between schemata and what he terms images, Bilder, abstracted from empirical experience, stating, quote, a schema of sensible concepts is a product and as it were a monogram of the pure a priori imagination through which and according to which images become possible in the first place. And similarly, Schelling rejects the understanding of Platonic elemental forms as types that represent abstract generalizations from token instances, and instead argues that Plato's elements are, like Kantian schemata, universal forms that constitutively condition appearances as such. So Schelling writes, quote, one thus sees clearly the extent to which Plato is speaking of intelligible archetypes of every individual object, namely not insofar as he believed that every individual object has its particular individual archetype, so not like the cartoon version of the theory of forms, but rather insofar as each individual object stands under the universal form of all existence. All right. So to be very clear, my aim here is really emphatically not to evaluate whether or not Schelling's mashup of Plato and Kant is convincing. It's obviously very unclear what it could possibly mean to call something like fire a rule for apprehension or a condition of possibility on appearances in a philosophically meaningful sense. So for now, what I'm interested in is just to note the way in which Schelling's early attempts to intervene in Kant's theory of intuition proceed. That is, the way in which he attempts to modify the categories by cutting them apart from spatio-temporal intuition, and then to modify the schematism by offering a symbolic version of it that runs through the elements in this way. So this is all very suggestive, but I don't think we end up with a conclusive, concrete view here. By the time of the 1804 philosophy of art, however, Schelling's views about symbolic intuition have become much more. In particular, he's begun to focus on the symbolic power of one kind of object in particular, specifically the work of art. So before, we're obviously talking about philosophical use of symbolic intuition, and Schelling, like Hegel, somewhat like Hegel, has a view where he thinks that there's philosophy is one register of knowing, artistic production is another register of knowing, and they get this right from Romanticism, this notion that poetry, that art can communicate truth. And I think Schelling then, moves away from trying to describe a philosophical picture that actually demonstrates the sensible character of reason, and begins to think the work of art is really the place where you're going to need to look for any kind of sensible exhibition of reason. He ends up thinking that art is the best kind of symbol of the absolute, by 1804 at least. So Schelling's views about art are highly complex, but to give a very bare bones summary, he believes at this point in his career, and I think actually throughout his career, that art consists fundamentally in a display of the relationship between universal and particular in the medium of the particular. This is obviously a very abstract formulation, but I'll give some examples in a moment after I lay out the view. And any Hegelians in the audience will again mark the similarity to Hegel's understanding of art as a sensible presentation of the absolute idea. And Schelling has his own ideas about what the terms universal and particular mean, but for our purposes, I think it is still helpful to continue to link them back to Kant's ideas of reason and intuition respectively, So once more, the function of art on Schelling's view is to display the universal in the particular. The proper subject matter of art is, in turn, the divine, which is obviously a descendant of the Kantian notion of God as an idea of reason. For Schelling, however, the divine is not, or at least not only, the monotheistic Christian God, but rather a polytheistic notion. And this begins to get at Schelling's views about the relationship between universal and particular. Divinity in general is a kind of universal, whereas the various deities who comprise a given theogony, say the Greek one, are particular instances of divinity. So Schelling holds that the most proper subject matter of art is mythology, because it gives this sort of multifarious account of the divine universal. And this is, I think, a direct callback to our earlier discussion of symbolic intuition. The artwork, by treating the topic of mythology, provides a symbolic exhibition of the idea of reason, or at least it can, i.e. of the divine, by means of taking up the gods as its subject matter. This link is further underlined by Schelling's assertion that, quote, the basic law of all portrayals of the gods is beauty, for beauty is the absolute, i.e. the universal, intuited in reality, right? So we are still working with this structure of exhibiting concepts in intuition. That's exactly the structure that underlies Schelling's theory of artistic presentation. In the philosophy of art, Schelling describes a taxonomy of artworks that's carved up according to the different ways in which they combine universal and particular terms. Schelling argues that there are three different kinds of artworks: schematic, allegorical, and symbolic, each of which displays one of three different synthetic relationships between universal and particular terms. He writes, and this is on the handout, that representation, and this is Schelling, that representation in which the universal means the particular, or in which the particular is intuited through the universal, is schematism. That representation, however, in which the particular means the universal, or in which the universal is intuited through the particular, is allegory. And the synthesis of these two, where neither the universal means the particular, nor the particular the universal, but rather where both are absolutely one, is the symbolic. This, again, still very abstract. I promise there are examples on the horizon. So thus, in Schelling's picture, Kant's schematic and symbolic intuitive exhibitions have become modes of artistic creation, and different works of art exemplify instances of these various modes. This means notably that in this version of Schelling's picture, conceptual exhibition has become an explicitly human creative process rather than an a priori activity of mind. It's no longer, as Kant says, a hidden art in the depth, but rather an a posteriori activity that's very much undertaken in the light of day, or the darkness of the studio, but out in the world. Furthermore, as we'll see in a moment, Schelling describes schematism as a merely subordinate kind of artistic activity that's defined by the way in which it falls short of symbolism. So this is what we would expect to see, again, this hierarchy between symbol and schema. And finally, a third topic, allegory, has also been added to the mix. And this is an inheritance of, from Schelling's engagement with his more literary contemporaries like Goethe and Schlegel. There's a lot to be said. If you do German studies at all, like this, there's a robust tradition. People still work on this a lot. People really don't in philosophy, but the theory of the symbol. So the easiest way to get a hold of the salient differences amongst these three kinds of artworks will finally be by means of some examples. Although Schelling is unfortunately somewhat vague at this point in the text, he does make an attempt to discuss what it would mean to treat Greek mythology in all of these three ways. So the allegorical account of Greek mythology is the one that's likely familiar to all of us from some point in our education. On this view, mythological stories are just so stories that stand in for something else, usually a more historically sophisticated form of explanation. So a weather god, for example, would stand in for meteorological phenomena. And Zeus pouring over his scales might stand in for the powerlessness of temporally bound creatures in the face of futurity, or something like that. Notice that Schelling's use of allegory here is actually very close to the original Kantian notion of symbol that we discussed previously, right? An allegorical intuition is an inadequate exhibition of the concept it attempts to display that falls short of the thing it's trying to exhibit. The attempt to describe a schematic reading of mythology is less easy to tease out, and I think mostly because Schelling doesn't really think this is possible. He doesn't really think many artworks actually proceed schematically, because the creation of objects in a schematic manner is not really artistic creation, right? It's rule governed. It's more akin to technical reproduction. So I have this quote from Schelling talking about schematism in art, and he says, quote, "One can see most clearly what a schema is from the example of the mechanical artist who is to create an object with some definite form according to its concept. This concept schematizes itself for him, that is, it becomes immediate for him in the imagination in its universality, simultaneously as the particular and as an intuition of the particular." Some Schellingese there. The schema is the rule guiding his production, but he intuits in this universal simultaneously the particular itself. I think this is actually basically a fancy way of talking about like what you're doing when you're putting together a piece of IKEA furniture, right? That you are basically following a set of rules, given a set of parts, and creating a thing. There's no surprise, there's no genius, right? There's no genius of IKEA furniture building. I don't have it. Anyway, so it's not really artistic production. Now, Schelling's account of the symbolic work of art is his most original contribution, I think. And I just will say briefly, the guy for Schelling on the symbol is Daniel Whistler. He has this really fabulous book, Schelling's Theory of Symbolic Language, that everybody should read if they have any interest in this topic. It's very excellent, and I am in a lot of dialogue with here. A lot of this is borrowed from him. So as the passage before last intimates, the symbolic work of art occupies this sort of golden mean between the allegorical and the schematic, right? It's not too rule governed, but it's not in any way rule governed where it's such that it falls short of the thing it's trying to show off. According to Schelling, the crucial feature of the symbolic work of art is, quote, that the universal is completely the particular, and the particular simultaneously the entire universal, and the particular does not merely mean or signify the universal. The requirement is poetically resolved in mythology, since each figure in it is to be taken as that which it is. For precisely in this way is each also taken as that which it means or signifies. Meaning here is simultaneously being itself, passed over into the object itself, and one with it. Okay, so difficult to get a handle on, but here's some more specification. Sticking with this example of mythology, Schelling further writes, quote, the complete dissociation of the Greek fantasy from the allegorical manifests itself with a particular clarity in the fact that even personification that might easily be taken to be allegorical beings, for example, Eris or strife or discord, are treated not at all as beings that are supposed to mean or signify something, but rather as real beings that are simultaneously that which they signify. So the idea here, a couple of features that are important. The characteristic trait of the symbolic symbol, according to Schelling, is the self-referential nature of this kind of conceptual exhibition. This is a challenging idea to get fully into view. How does this from allegory? But I think it's most helpful to think of this in Mariological terms. The Schellingian symbol is a part that contains or bears the entirety of the whole it belongs to. So when you have this individual Greek god who's a persona, a character in some way, that they're simultaneously an individual and they represent the entire pantheon, all of divinity in general, in their individual being. I think it's similar, if it's helpful to anyone, to a logical form, like the form of a mathematical fractal, where every single part reiterates the form of the whole. Or if you do Leibniz at all, I think the monad does this also. It reiterates, every single individual reiterates the whole. I am getting close on time, so I'll just quickly mention the philosophy of mythology. There, Schelling uses this term tautogorical to describe the specific structure of symbol and its self-referential character. And once again, by specific contrast to outline, I think what becomes of Kant's theory of the symbol is basically, it ends up being Schellingian allegory. And we now have this new notion of the tautogorical symbol that's supposed to satisfy the post-Kantian aesthetic demand, right, by displaying an idea of reason. And it does so specifically insofar as it has this special structure of referentiality by means of which an individual that is a part of a whole can actually represent the entirety of the whole. So now I very briefly do want to say a little bit about Hegel. I spent a lot of time on Schelling mostly because I think no one ever spends a lot of time with these texts usually, and I just wanted to talk about them a bit. I think they're really interesting. But my end game and my goal in the paper was to say a little bit about where we might find this in Hegel's thought. And so on the handout, I have kind of a collation of Hegel's criticisms of Schelling. And what he praises. And it turns out, I think people in general think that Hegel rejects more from Schelling than he actually does. But when you look at it, it actually turns out that Hegel takes on a lot of the things we've been discussing, right? He takes on Schelling's interest in rejecting the categories of the understanding. He takes on Schelling's interest in Naturphilosophie. He rejects the thing he really, really doesn't like from Schelling is his method. He doesn't like construction and intellectual intuition, which is Schelling's getting from Fichte mostly Fichte. But he does, I think, he likes what Schelling says about the work of art, but he thinks that far enough, right? That he finds this great structure of unification of universal in particular in the work of art. But what Schelling didn't see was that actually you should be able to do this in the register of thinking, right? Of pure thought. Pure thought should be able to do this. So just very quickly, I'll describe how I think Hegel takes this on. I think Hegel, on my reading, I think Hegel takes from Schelling this notion of the adequate symbol. He's like, this is a great idea that we should have a part that can fully represent the whole. And he's like, and moreover, I think I can use this to actually give a new account of how the structure of the a priori structure of mind works. So on my reading, I think that the relationship that Hegel describes between the forms of judgment and inference and his concept are actually structured in exactly this way that that Schelling has laid out in his account of symbolic artistic form. That Hegel thinks that in the same way that each of the Greek gods represents divinity, each form of judgment and inference serves as a symbol of the concept. And in this way, the concept provides itself with content by means of a set of symbols that exhibit its activity. And further, this set of symbols is comprised of nothing other than its own rational forms. I think this is, yes, that was really fast. I didn't really have time to get into it. And I'm happy to talk about it more if people are interested. But just by way of conclusion, the important thing here is to take away is the sort of geometry of symbolic intuition, as it begins in Kant as the symbol as a sort of attempt to exhibit rational ideas in a privative way. Schelling's taking it up and saying, actually, reason is demonstrated in art, this extremely romantic post-Kantian view. But then I think Hegel uses in his own account of mind, in his own account of apperceptive synthesis, in order to give a symbolic account of the exhibition of pure reason. Okay, that was a lot, so I will stop there. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So what I'm going to do, I think the easiest way is to type in the chat. If you have a question, just say, put me in the queue, and I can keep a queue for questions. Jake, you're up first.
You're on mute.
Sorry, thanks, Eliza. I love this talk and I love this project. I need some help understanding this flipping on its head move.
Okay.
What justifies it? It seems like it's the key move in the argument. As I understand it, what's going on is something like this. Kant says, sensible intuition isn't congruent with the idea, so much the worse for the idea. And then Schelling and Hegel et al. Come along and they say, so much the worse for sensible intuition, or at least ordinary spatiotemporal. Who's right? What is the argument for why you're able to, go break one way as opposed to the other way? Sort of be pro-reason, pro the idea, as opposed to being, anti-reason or anti the idea. And that's obviously modulo the stuff Kant has about symbol and allegory and the kind of things he thinks might work, but he's not so sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I kind of go back and forth. Some days I think, well, maybe one view is that you could there's two options, right? Like you can have an empirically realist picture or you can have a rationally realist picture, right? And you can maybe decide, but I don't think actually that's going to be the right answer, at least for Hegel. Schelling, I don't make a lot of authoritative claims to, but for Hegel as a post-Kantian, I think that the reason why this is going to end up being a problem is that it turns out you actually need reason in order to account for the categories of the understanding and why you can have that picture at all, so that picture is going to be derived. The anti-empirically real picture will be the empirically real picture will be derived from the anti-empirically real picture. Like you have to give an account of the reality of rational ideas on Hegel's view in order to say anything about the understanding in the first place. Does that satisfy you?
Yeah.
Emma?
Hi, thank you so much. This was brilliant. I don't do a lot of work on this stuff, so this is one of the first times I feel like I've grasped it. So thank you. So I'm going to take your suggestion of comparing this methodology with geometrical methodology in the early modern period. And my idea is this, that we know that sometimes in geometrical methodology, we have examples, right? We have Spinoza's scholium, or Descartes uses some too. Even Euclid obviously does. But I think there I find it more justified because the object is difficult. They admit it's difficult, but it's knowable. So they try to make it more understandable through examples, through imagination. But if you even remotely agree with Kant that some objects are unknowable, why would you go through the trouble of trying to present an intuition of it? Like, why should we care? This is kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? Like, I mean, it's almost perverse. Why do the post-Kantians want to use Kant in order to achieve this? And this gets at something I said in the introduction and didn't quite explicitly state in the paper, but I do think one huge between the pre-Kantian rationalists and the post-Kantian rationalists is going to be the role that divine mind plays for them. And for Hegel, at least on my reading, I know this is controversial, on my reading, there is absolutely no role for a divine concept of reason, and that puts all of the burden on giving an exhibition of the existence of things on human reason, right? So that in a way, it's imperative if human reason wants to say anything about knowability of the world and of its objects, it has to, in a way, it's our vocation, I think, actually, and to take a Fichtean word, it's our vocation to give these kinds of exhibitions of rational form. It's so, in a way, we have to do this because there is no divine mind to underwrite it for us in the way that I at least think there was in the early modern philosophical picture.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I can insert myself in the queue here. Maybe I have a bunch of questions brewing, but maybe I'll just ask a really general one, which is sort of trying to connect the beginning of your paper to the end of your paper. Because I really loved the way that you emphasized I think you called it that there's an aesthetic, in the OSP, there's an aesthetic concern to philosophical thinking and an aesthetic demand that reason be made sensible. And then in the end, your example of the way that symbolic intuition comes to work in Hegel seemed, the question of the sensible seemed to drop out if the symbolic intuition of the concept is fully articulated through, right, forms of judgment and syllogism. So we're sort of back into the domain of pure thought. And then I lost the sort of coming back to the beginning of the paper of this, what I really liked, which was the aesthetic demand of reason being made sensible. So maybe you could say more about how the beginning and the end fit back together.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity because it did get a little. So I think in order to link up the kind of Kantian symbolic project with the Hegelian symbolic project, the way you're absolutely right that, of course, by the time you get into something like the science of logic, you're not talking about the sensible anymore. And I think what Hegel does is he takes Kant's aesthetic. I mean, this is actually like a premise of my understanding of Hegel, is that he takes Kant's aesthetic and he says Kant made a mistake in the transcendental aesthetic. He was running three things together. And these three things were, first of all, the perceptual situation of finite perceivers. Second of all, space and time as forms of externality. And then third of all, conceptual exhibition. And Hegel thinks we can actually cut these things apart. So in the logical realm, there's this notion of exhibition that has nothing to do with sensible perception as it applies to me as a finite rational perceiver. But it is, the reason why it still remains linked up is first of all, just by virtue of being descended from the Kantian idea, but second of all, because it gives concepts content. I think that the link is going to be conceptual act, that an exhibition in intuition is required in order for concepts to be contentful. And so then the forms as determinations are going to provide the concept, right, Hegel's concept, with its first content, at least in the abstract register. But then actually, I do think at the same time, so it's, well, maybe two further things. One being that I think we can read this as a modification of claims Kant makes in the paralogisms about the way mind can't take itself as an object. Like, how does a self become present to itself? I think Hegel's making a claim in subjectivity about that, right? And then he's saying, actually, mind becomes present to itself in every single act of judgment or inference, in every rational act that it performs, right? In the way each individual determined act is an intuition that's displaying the existence of reason, of rational conceptuality in general. But then also, and I have your reading in mind, and maybe you can tell me, maybe I'll ask you a question about how it might fit together, because I think you're absolutely right. You're going to need a further story, right? Like, it's obviously not, Hegel's not the kind of rationalist where it's just mind up here with the forms of reason on its own, giving itself the content solipsistically and independently, right? He's very interested in the notion that rationality will ultimately be finite and embodied and living in a world, engaging with a world. And in that situation, I think that I would want to say that it's enough to begin by saying there's this kind of very abstract apperceptive picture that takes rational forms to be the very first, the most abstract sort of conceptual content. But then I think in the concept logic, it gets developed, right? You obviously get many further iterations of judgment and of syllogism, right? And so by the time that you have life, to take your example, because it occurred to me, you end up with a much more robust notion of what a judgment is, kind of judgment you're talking about in the bare bones subjectivity section, where judgment is like S is P, right? It's a much different notion that I think Hegel's interested in filling it out over the course of the chapter.
That was a great answer. Thank you. So I have Richard Eldridge is next.
Yes, thanks. I want to ask a broad question about your motivations, touching on the question about justification that Jacob McNulty asked. So to back up a little bit, you mentioned the notion of vocation from Fichte, and the idea of the determination of life according to reason in Kant is also in view here. Kant wants us, after all, wants to show us how to overcome skepticism and the kind of nomadism or inability to settle in life that may perhaps entail despair that's haunting us in the modern period. And what I want to ask is this the background to your interest in Schelling? Are you suggesting that the theory of the symbol is a way of re-enchanting the world so as to make it, I don't know, possible for us to live in it in accordance with our vocation? And if that is the background, I find it very interesting, but I also worry that it's kind of a fairy tale. So I wonder if you could comment on, the motivations, background, and whether we can do better than a fairy tale here.
That's a big burden, but I'll try to do justice. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think you're absolutely right to touch on this question of enchantment, re-enchantment. Like, obviously, in the tradition I was trained in, I spent a lot of time with John McDowell early on in this, thinking about this topic of enchantment in German philosophy. And I found myself very dissatisfied with this sort of dichotomy between the enchanted and the disenchanted. And something I like about Hegel, I think they give us resources for seeing the world as not being that way. There's no such thing as a disenchanted world, right? Like, science is one set of explanations, that's fine. But these other explanations, I think, for Hegel and Schelling are going to have also a place in human life, these fairy tales, right? And I think it's a question, like, obviously, on the one hand, no, we can't just decide to make up a set of fun stories about the world and then fix the difficulties with it. But on the other hand, I do think there's really something to be said for the idea of advancing a notion of rationality, of what it is to be a rationally minded being that focuses on the kind of creative activity that I do in something like art or philosophy or religion. And in a way, it kind of allows us to move back to almost a Greek notion of like a different, like what is an end for humanity, right? That it might be an activity that's for the sake of itself, such as the production of exhibitions of rational form. Seems just as good to me, at least, as any other activity we do. So I think that in a way, that part of what I like about it is just this mind-focused aspect. But yeah, did I understand correctly what you were asking about?
I think so. I mean, I have my sympathies with the importance of art and with some form of re-enchantment, certainly. I guess my own suspicions still center around whether we need an ontology or cosmology to prop up the account of what art helps us to do. I'd be more inclined to focus on reconciliations in the moral life and in social relations, or on something like what Wordsworth called nameless little unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Art helps with that, and that's to me where the action is. And that pulls me away from cosmology and ontology.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think in general, obviously people are going to focus more on practical philosophy when they try to give an account like that. But I'm like just by character, a diehard theoretical person. And so I was interested in like what optimistic elements are there in the theoretical picture. Yeah, thanks.
Edith? You're muted.
Okay. I'm not sure the question would be quite clear, but you began the paper at one point where you brought in the question of the mos geometricus, or moral geometry. You never returned to it, okay? Now, in terms of, I think one of the things I want to suggest is that you probably need a much more robust, in order to talk about the aesthetic, you need a much more robust notion of aistasis than we get after Baumgarten, let's say, okay? Because you brought the Greeks in, aistasis in the real sense, but even if I take Spinoza, to whom both Schelling and Hölderlin and Hegel at least were indebted, let's go. First of all, the status of definitions, or even what stands for what, is either by X I understand, or X is said to be, not X is. You never get an X is in Spinoza, okay? You never get an analytic definition. It's always a Euclidean definition. And at the very end of the ethics, and why the ethics, which also gives you an entry why the ethics is an ethics, or why ethics aesthetics, okay, or aistasis, is, he says, prae clara cum difficilia su quam rara, okay? The things that are most prae clara, shine forth most, okay, are as difficult as they are rare. Not that they're inaccessible, but it's still, the question is still a question of aistasis, okay? And how that the question of aistasis ultimately will inform action. Why the ethics is an ethics and not a metaphysics primarily. Okay, so I would like you to reflect on that, back to the relation, okay, to the question of the mos, okay, the way in which, okay, we make something visible so as to provide a way of imitation. You can still remain a theoretical, you can still remain a speculative philosopher, but nonetheless, without avoiding this and giving us perhaps a more robust account of aistasis, to which you refer to several times.
Yeah, no, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's something that Hegel at least is really interested to do, certainly, right? That I think there's a lot of continuity for him between just his ordinary everyday theory of perception and his theory art, and then his theory perhaps also of a higher rational kind of intuition. I think that's actually helpful through, especially in understanding the nature of Hegel's post-Kantianism, which I would want to lean on and say, there are things I can't be responsible for because he's a post-Kantian, right? We've made a break. We've made this Copernican break with the old tradition. And now I really only need to wrangle with my subjective situation, right? And I can work from there. I can work from a notion of experience as a starting point in order to give an account of how rational form will appear. And I think that, I mean, it is obviously very different methodologically, just because Hegel isn't going to be interested at all in constructing things, right? He's interested in giving dialectical accounts, whatever those are, and whether or not you buy that, obviously a different question. But I think he's very interested in just the idea that as a human being, it's very available to me to just whatever project I undertake in philosophy, religion, or art has a good chance of at least saying something about absolute form. So it's almost like a lower bar to entry, maybe, than pre.
I see a question here from Piteri Limnell. I don't know if you want to ask your question, or I can read it out. I can read it out. So it says, I remember that Kant denied intellectual intuition, but Schelling thought that it was possible. Could you please talk about this?
Yeah, definitely. So yes, the other piece of the story, and something I very vaguely touched on towards the end, so Hegel, who I'm interested in, will deny intellectual intuition. Kant obviously does deny intellectual intuition too, and in between, Schelling thinks some version is possible. And I think it's really important to know that people talk about intellectual intuition in different ways, and that intellectual intuition gets a sort of bad name for having this connotation of being a kind of immediate cognition, like a shot from a pistol, I think, critiquing it, right? It's like suddenly you just understand, but that's not at all the notion of intellectual intuition that Schelling is working with in most of his works, and maybe in very, very early ones, but not for the most of his, in the identity philosophy in his kind of middle early period is when he's really talking about this. And for Schelling and Fichte, intellectual intuition is really derived from Kant's theory of geometry. And then again, as Edith was just talking about, from this geometrical method that predates Kant. And so it's really a theory of construction. And I think the best parallel is to understand it as a philosophical version of what it is we're doing when we complete a geometric proof. Like if I'm going to look at Euclid's original text, for example, and build a triangle by using his instructions, that's a geometric proof that would be in a kind of, it's almost akin to intellectual intuition. And then for Schelling and Fichte, that's basically what you're supposed to do philosophically. So if you look at any of Schelling's texts, part of actually what I think what makes them so challenging from this period, like around the philosophy of art, is that he's writing them in this way where he's trying to construct proofs about things that aren't really, at least to my Hegelian mind, they don't seem very constructible at all, right? Like they seem like things you need to like talk through more organically, but instead he's saying, I'm going to give you a proof derived from first principles of like what art is. This version of intellectual intuition, I think, is relatively benign, right? He's not, I mean, that's in terms of method, at least, like it's a maybe a kind of a crappy method, but I don't think it's like a horrible monstrosity. I think Hegel, so on the one hand, Hegel's rejection of intellectual intuition is a rejection of intellectual intuition as a philosophical method. Then of course, there's another question about intellectual intuition as sort of like the form of rationality in general. Like, is there a kind of intellectual intuition that belongs to
Eliza, you froze. Can you hear us?
I think this was the risk that she was talking about.
About the island, yeah.
I know she has a backup plan. So let's give her a minute to
Yeah, we can give her a minute for sure.
see if this works.
The fun of Zoom.
Mhm.
Okay, so she's probably going to try to sign back in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Feel free to, you can put them in the chat. I'm happy to read them out, or if there are other microphone or connection issues. I know that happens.
In the meantime, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, do we usually aim for 75 or 90 minutes?
90 if there is
Okay.
enough questions.
Okay.
I don't want people to feel obliged. In the meantime, I was just gonna remind everybody that we have a very rich calendar this semester. So Enrico will be the next speaker, and then we will have Richard Eldridge. I'm also gonna invite you all to reach out to me if you were only booking for this session and you don't receive the general updates for VAMP in general. Please reach out to me at emanuele.costa@vanderbilt.edu, and I'll be happy to add you to the general mailing list.
Yeah, perhaps mention the next one. I don't have it in front of me.
Yes, so the next one is Enrico Galbagni on Sophie de Grouchy on the philosophy of pain.
Check my email and see if there's an update from her.
Enrico, the good news seems that you seem to have a very stable connection.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm not on an island actually, so I'm close to the sea anyway.
I would be very happy to be on an island, anything on water. Yeah, envy you, Emma. I'm shamelessly envious. I miss my Mediterranean. So nothing.
Yeah, it's too bad. It's too bad. This vision. Oh, I thought that was another question. It was such a wonderful talk. I feel bad that she doesn't get to have the final word.
No, I love the talk.
She's probably just shut down from everything since she's not reaching out in any way.
No. Give her another minute. Sorry about this. I can't believe this hasn't happened to me teaching. I'm constantly thinking that this will happen every time I'm teaching.
Yeah, that's my horror, but fortunately I have Andrew to help me. Hopefully he'll be able to step in if I disappear. Yeah, there is. Yeah, that's really a shame. I would have liked.
Yeah, I feel bad if she gets back if we call it too soon.
Well, let's give it another 10, 11 minutes, whatever. And if she doesn't come, she doesn't come. It is a shame. And because it also, we so rarely get much on Schelling, except in very small.
Oh, I see her.
Yes.
She's coming back.
We can't hear you.
Welcome.
Now you're on mute, I think.
Is that working?
Yes, you're back.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I had a complete internet disaster. I'm sorry.
No, we're glad you're back.
Sorry. Did everyone leave? Or?
No, we're all still here. You were talking about intellectual intuition. I don't know.
I was saying something about it. Maybe that was the end of the answer. I don't know. Who was the questioner? Peter, the person from the chat had asked it, right?
Yes, PT. Yes, I see him still there.
Okay.
Yeah, Jake, go ahead.
Save me, Jake, please.
I'll save you. Or maybe not, I don't know. So my question is about Hegel, and I think it goes back to Karen's question. And I guess I'm a little skeptical that Hegel is part of this story, but you can maybe help me understand why he's. So the stuff that Hegel does in the subjective logic, I guess there are different ways of thinking about it. What I would have said before I heard your talk was, well, he's having reason basically he's not, as it were, merging reason and the sensible. It's like a hostile takeover. Like reason is now going to do what the sensible used to do, so you can get rid of it, fire it, let it go, make it redundant. And that seems very different from Schelling and the more romantic idea of like, they're gonna get together, they're gonna merge, they're gonna cooperate, they're gonna join hands, as I think the OSP says. So I guess I need some help seeing how Hegel is part of this story. I mean, he's definitely trying to make reason do on its own what sensibility can do, but is that the same as what these other guys are doing? It seems like it could even, in a sense, be very much opposed to what they're doing. Or at least so it seems to me, and I'd like some help sort of thinking about how to bridge the gap.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Obviously, I mean, Hegel isn't just like a diehard romantic who wants mythology to be the true object, right? Like that's not Hegel. I don't think anyone could read him that way, not even me, and I want like a very romantic reading of Hegel. But I do think, I mean, when you think about what Hegel thinks is a proper object, you do end up with this very anti-Kantian and anti-rationalist in a lot of ways account, right? Hegel thinks that art, religion, and philosophy are the things we should really be talking about as proper objects, properly knowable objects, right? And I think that you only get that in order to get a view like that, you have to run through something like the romantic view, right? I think he's trying to like assimilate to domesticate, maybe is the best way, the romantic view. And he's saying like, look, it's not about people, it's not something like Athena is like the true object. Not that that's really Schelling's view, right? But like, you don't have to be as eccentric to be nice to Schelling as Schelling is, but like you need to have something to say about what it is these kinds of productions do and why they're so important in human life, right? And I do think, like, even, I know you and I have differences in our readings, like even on very different readings, it's undeniable that he thinks these forms of historical cultural production are really, really important, right? And they're going to be of central philosophical interest. And I think that when you look at that goal of Hegel's, that's when it begins to come into view that he really has this interest in altering the kind of object that is a proper object for thought. Is that persuasive? Maybe.
This is maybe like if we were at a conference, this would be like a finger to Jake's question. Maybe another way of getting at it is to, so I think in the beginning of the paper, and Schelling's language is very much revolves around this problem of Darstellung. But it seems that, and that fits the question of sensible presentation. But so I'm thinking just about passages from the Logic when Hegel he does talk about, the self-exhibition or self-expression or manifestation translated in different ways. But usually, from what I can remember, the language is very different. It's Äußerung, it's Offenbaren, it's he does use the term manifestation too, I think, if I remember correctly. So maybe that's another way of asking, again, that same question, where however reason is exhibiting itself in this sort of hyper-rationalist or conceptual form that you get in Hegel, or at least that you get in the Logic, still seems many steps removed from that original question of aesthetic sensibility, or this problem of Darstellung.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, obviously, I mean, there's not going to be like you can't do, I wish you could, like just a quick like reception of the language kind of read it, right? Like it's obviously much more indirect than that. It has to do with, you have to read it out of sort of the structural situation, I think, of Hegel's texts. And it involves, of course, an intervention into saying something about what I think he is up to, what he wants, or what the goal of philosophy is for him. But I do think, of course, like Hegel we know he's very interested in this relationship between inner and outer. And I think that when you look, especially the kind of the text for understanding Hegel really engaging with Kant on this issue is Faith and Knowledge, the 1802 essay, where he talks a lot about this notion from the third critique, from the critique of aesthetic judgment, of the way that the sensible, the beautiful is the symbol of the morally good. And he kind of just maps, he's like, the beautiful is the sensible, the morally good is the super sensible on his reading of Kant. And he's like, his primary point of interest, I think, there is that the idea that somehow the sensible world displays the super sensible world. And that's why I think you get this original interest in Hegel in the relationship between the way something exhibits, the ways the sensible exhibits the rational. And moreover, he's really interested in this way. That's where we get into this technical account that I didn't give in the paper, but about Kant's theory of analogy, right? That this kind of synthesis, when you are symbolizing something rather than schematizing it, proceeds in a different way. And precisely, it proceeds in a reflective way. And I think that's where you make room in the Hegelian picture for this sort of role of our finite-mindedness in creating the world, right? Not in like this God intellectual intuition way, but in this sort of, we create our world when we make a philosophical intervention, when we make a religious intervention, when we make an artistic intervention, maybe most of all there, it's most obvious. So I do think that's where you get Hegel's interest in this form of synthesis that comes along with symbolic intuition.
Great. Any other questions? Yep, Jennifer Holt.
Hi, I want to just follow up quickly on something you were saying and admit a point of ignorance that I need some help with. And it's that back in one of the bits of Schelling that you quoted, there's reference to the functioning of a monogram. And it did make me wonder about the difference between the way the monogram is working in that passage and the way the symbol works for Kant. And I can't tell the difference. I sense that there's a nice technical explanation, but I don't know what it is.
I think it's charitable of you to think there's a nice technical explanation. I think if it were Kant, there would be. When you're with Schelling, I think all bets are kind of off. He's often playing a bit fast and loose with the language, and you have to more get a sense for the form. But monogram is a Kantian idea, and he often uses it to describe the way in which the forms, like a higher or more logically prior set of forms, appears in a logically posterior set of forms. So, for example, the way the categories, the pure categories, appear in empirical appearances. You seek the monogram of the understanding or something like that in those instances. So that's, I think, the idea that Schelling probably has in mind there, is something like the way we can get a hold of, like, we see something that is, when we talk about it philosophically, going to be logically prior, but we're viewing it in the logically posterior, in something like a work of art, or a philosophy or something like that.
Any other questions? Well, I think this is the time to thank Eliza for her wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for participating and for their questions.
Thank you for bearing with me. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry about the technical crisis.
No, we're glad you made it back.
So, and thanks for all your questions and for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for attending. We hope to see you